The thing is that we have to go to a higher order than this. We can't use reason on somebody that's not valuing reason in the decision-making process. You would have, if you really want to have reason.
I do value reason. It's just I'm talking about something that's not
lighter and faster and stronger.
No.
They're convinced that I exist, but they don't believe that I exist.
Kind of being part of a tribe in a way that you find yourself surrounded by like-minded people, and like-minded in the sense of being skeptical of religious claims. And so, since religion features so prominently, especially here in America and in culture, to just find other people that are skeptical about those sorts of things is empowering. And I think a lot of it, what undergirds it, is really kind of a naive skepticism. It's just kind of just missing these concepts, that they're not of any use or any value, and so that they should just be discarded. And the other people that don't discard them are being irrational.
By the way, we had some sound fail at the beginning, audio issues. It was just typical of this particular channel and of me, myself. So let me just kind of reintroduce Ben from A Real Atheology, because as soon as I asked you a question, I realized from the audience, hey, you guys can't hear what the hell we're talking about. So again, welcome to Atheological Aholes, where we talk about theology for atheists, where atheists can actually learn about the topic of atheism because they don't seem to know much about it. So I had asked Ben why atheists generally don't want to learn about atheism. If they think that atheism is merely some non-position of just merely lacking a belief, then what is it to have discussions of? What is it they have atheist groups on? What is it that they go into these atheist and theist forums for if all they do is go, hey, I don't believe you, I lack a belief? That's not atheism. It has never been atheism in philosophy as any kind of standardized version of it. Now, there are alternative, quote, definitions, which are describing people's usages, but as a normative, as far as what you ought to use in philosophy, if you want to learn philosophy properly, you want to read the papers properly, it's going to be in a positive epistemic status. So what I kind of want to do is I want to have people call in, especially atheists, will call in and answer these kind of questions about what do they think about atheism and why do they even associate with atheism if all they want to do is just kind of push it to the side and not learn about the complexities of the topic of atheology, which Ben knows quite a bit about. So I'd asked Ben that question, and that was his answer, which you're listening to.
Especially if the idea is to slap the label agnostic in front of atheist. That's always been a strange move to me. Why is the label of being an atheist and being part of atheist groups important if you're also going to have this agnostic label slapped on in the front of it? Why not just call yourself an agnostic or call yourself an atheist and distinguish between the two? And so I think the best answer I have for that question is the one that I just gave, and that it's, there is a tribe that considers themselves atheists, skeptics, free thinkers. There's a movement, certainly a political movement as well, that's been largely kindled by the new atheist movement I think it started in 2005, 2006-ish. So it emboldened a religious skepticism that's really responding to the religious fundamentalism in America, which in itself is not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with that.
And I agree with you there. Yeah.
But that's the only thing that's the only plausible answer I can come up with to why, there's several mistakes that I think are going on, but they think that this idea of being just an atheist, a pure atheist, implies some sort of certainty, some sort of a certainty that their skepticism just won't allow them to have at all. And so that's where they think this role of an agnostic comes in.
Yeah, they think they're being more precise, and the irony of the situation is they're being more imprecise. They're being more vague because they always have to follow to a follow-up question. What do you mean by this? And I'm sorry, but whoever wrote that Wikipedia article on agnostic atheism needs to rethink their profession or something. And I don't know why a professional philosopher has not gone in and fixed that, because even if you look at the talk, how they have a talk page, it is just it completely just annihilates what's on the page. It's like, no, this is nonsense kind of stuff. And so I agree. I don't know why they want to do, one, downplay, the role of atheism if they want to attach the agnostic label. Two, they're just they're conflating very two different domains of discourse, right? Because atheism is a deistic position. It is a belief position. It has to do with your position on an ontological question of an existential nature. I mean, if a being exists, right, it has nothing to do with knowledge, because knowledge is a subset of belief. So throwing in the agnostic thing and trying to make it some kind of epistemological domain, to me, to juxtapose those things together makes no sense, especially because even if you use it that way, it's one is answering a different question, like, is God's knowable, which is fine in the epistemological domain, or two, it's trying to modify something, but what is it modifying? If it's not, if both of them are non-belief, what is it? I have non-belief and I'm not sure? No, you're pretty sure you have non-belief or not.
And I also think that there's kind of this game of hide the ball with a burden of justification, what's often called a burden of proof. And so it seems to be to want to say that no, that that whatever their position is, whatever it is that they're going to call their position, it doesn't have a burden of proof or a burden of justification. That it is a default position, and that their position is the rational one until something comes along and pushes them out of that default position, which is, certainly an easy game for the skeptic to make. If you're just playing the game of pure skepticism, all you have to do is philosophize with a hammer and just bash whatever is put in front of you. Just say, nope, that doesn't work. Nope, that doesn't work. Nope, that doesn't work. And so you can get a lot of mileage out of kind of this naive skepticism of just dismissing all of these religious arguments that might be put on the table, because again, at the end of the day, they don't see these concepts as being useful. They don't see these concepts as having any value in themselves or having any being part of any cogent argument. So to just dismiss these things with that naive skepticism is quite easy. And so if you're going to push back on that, then they're kind of out of their depth. Then they're going to start drawing distinctions, erroneous distinctions, or sharp distinctions that aren't really sharp. The one that comes to mind is the distinction between belief and knowledge. And I always point out, like, but knowledge entails belief. Mm-hmm. Like, I can't know something unless I believe it. So this, what are we getting? Like, if you're saying, I believe X, what are you getting when you say, instead, I know X? Well, you're getting at least truth, and you're getting at least justification. That's kind of the standard conception of knowledge, putting Gettier cases to one side. And it should be noticed right there in this conceptual analysis, certainty is not part of knowledge. Certainty is a property of persons. It's not a property of propositions. So I can be certain that the moon is made of cheese. Like, I can have that attitude. That can be a property about my psychology and say, I am certain the moon is made of cheese. But it's not the case that I know the moon is made of cheese, because it's not true that the moon is made of cheese. So I see that conceptual confusion everywhere.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I think a minor quibble. I think the psychological version of that would be called certitude. And certitude is not for propositions, it's for psychological indubitability. I do think that in what's called the strong acceptance case for knowledge, it would require certainty, but most philosophers, when I read their papers, they don't accept the strong acceptance case, except what's called the weak acceptance case, which just means knowledge entails belief, but doesn't require certainty. And that's pretty well ubiquitous.
And there's also another intuition that's certainly motivating this, and an intuition, a good intuition that I would accept, is that we can't know something that's false. If something is false, I can't know it.
Right.
And so you might be tempted to say, well, that means you have to be certain that it's not false. And that's the part that I would disagree with. I would want to resist that. I would want to say that knowledge is at least justified true belief. Knowledge implies belief, but belief does not imply knowledge. And I'd want to say certainty might imply knowledge, but knowledge does not imply certainty or certitude. I'm sorry, using the word certitude. And then I would want to say that there is no false knowledge. We cannot know a proposition unless it is also true.
Yeah. I mean, if you're certain that if you're certain implies knowledge, and knowledge implies belief, but not the converse. So not the other way around. So if you have belief, it doesn't imply knowledge. It doesn't imply certitude or certainty. But yeah, absolutely. There's no such thing as false knowledge. And I wrote an essay called The Principle of Attribution and Retraction. And it was basically upon that very principle that we don't say we had a false knowledge. We say we have a false belief. If I say it's going to rain tomorrow and tomorrow it doesn't rain, I just say, look, my belief was false. I believed it was going to rain, but it didn't. But if I say, no, it's going to rain tomorrow, and then tomorrow comes and it does not, I don't say my knowledge was false. I said I didn't have knowledge to begin with. I retract the claim that I ever had knowledge, rather than just, reattributing it as a false belief. But anyways, guess what? We have a first caller.
Awesome.
Hello, caller.
Hello.
What can we do you for?
What's up, Steve?
Brandon.
Yes, it is me. So for me, in the first place, you have to prove that the supernatural exists. It seems like you're already like giving it this, I don't know, saying that the supernatural exists, and then saying you gotta prove God without saying you gotta prove that the supernatural exists.
Well, I'll try to address that first. I do have a super chat I got to get to, and I will answer your question, Brandon, and then I want Ben to try and answer it. Second best Bob for £2 says, I don't believe in any God. I'm an atheist. There's no way to answer that based upon the information given. Atheism is also a label, right? It's not just a disposition towards a proposition, but it's also something people self-identify as a label. I can't label somebody based upon, that insufficient amount of information. I could just tell you in philosophy, the most I could get to logically by deductive logic without any kind of semantic substitution or induction is that you would be a non-theist, right? So you have theist, then you have the complementary set, which would be not theist. So anybody that's not a theist would be a not theist. So under non-theism, then you have atheism, agnosticism, skepticism, ichthyism, ischiism, and a few other freaking isms. But there's no way to answer that, Best Bob, based upon your information. And Ben, you want to try and answer that super chat too? And then we answered.
Yeah, so I would want to say that historically the question has been, are there any gods? Or that's the wide question. And the narrow question is, does God exist? Where God is an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being that's wholly worthy of our worship. And so I think we can easily demarcate the answers to this question. Theism says, yes, there is at least one God. Atheism says, no, there are no gods. Agnostics say that the answer is indeterminate or otherwise unknowable, or that the evidence doesn't favor one view over the other. And then there's non-theists that do not believe that the answer to this question is yes. So they don't accept either the theist answer or the atheist answer. And so I think that's all you need for the language game to work. You can do all the philosophy of religion related to the question, are there any gods or does God exist, with those labels. You don't need anything else. Now you can make modifications. You can add certain things to the, certain, you might deny that these religious claims have truth value. So you might be a non-cognitivist about religious claims. And so that you can further explicate this hierarchy of terms. But those four terms, I think, just exhaust the logical space in which we will answer this question. So when we take on one of these labels, we are putting ourselves in a camp. We are putting ourselves in a way of approaching a big question in the philosophy of religion that historically this is how people are going to have understood. If they have asked you this question and you said, well, I'm an atheist, they have an idea of what camp you're in. But if you say I'm an agnostic atheist, all of that historical precedence just gets lost in confusion.
Yeah, and it's sad because when you go to Texas, like you go to the Austin and you go to these small pockets of what I call mostly new atheist trademark. That, by the way, I didn't create that, but I call them that for a very specific reason because they have very specific mindsets that are very similar to what I run into with flat earthers and creationism. But when you say you're an atheist in those areas, all to them it just means you don't have a God belief, but it doesn't really impart any information about your actual beliefs. You go to some other country and you tell them you're an atheist, they're going to assume that you're claiming there are no gods because that's how they use the term. Now, I think you're right. I think it does exhaust the space. Now, I will throw in there is also innocent, but you can't label yourself innocent that's not a self-identifiable label because it'd be a contradiction, right? I put
that under the umbrella of non-theists.
Sure,
They're
sure,
just not theists.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I've had this really fascinating discussion. Before I get to Brandon, your question there, I had this fascinating discussion with a mutual friend, Ozzy, who we both, have the most reverence for. I mean, people used to say that, I like worship Ozzy. I'm like, no, I just think
amazing.
He's a brilliant man.
He's really just an amazing thinker and a great friend.
Yeah, great guy.
I have nothing but respect for him.
Nothing but respect for that man. And we had a really great talk on theological non-cognitivism and how we both kind of, I think, agreed that, to a theological non-cognitivist, they would not be either a theist or a not theist to them, right? To them, those categories are meaningless categories to begin with. They're non-existent categories. You can't have one or the complement set because of them, it's like gerbil, gibble, non-gerbil, gibble. It's meaningless. There's no such categories that even exist. It's just semantic stuff at that point. And I thought that was a very interesting approach that, what is a theological cognitivist, then? But we'll get into that another time. I think that's a fact. It's unless somebody calls in and wants more details on that atheism. So, Brandon, to your question, personally, I don't know how Ben does it, and not all in philosophy is like this. But for me, generally, when I talk about supernatural, I just put anything in the non-natural set into calling that supernatural. It is just a semantic word called supernatural that means the non-natural set. And I do not mean that with moral philosophy. The non-natural and moral philosophy means a completely different thing. But in physical philosophy, physicalism and things of that nature, when you're talking about materialism, that's all under naturalism. So if something isn't in the materialistic thing or something doesn't exist in the material world, I'm going to call that supernatural. And that only means because I believe it's so far outside our epistemic understanding that we just cannot really conceptualize what these concepts are of a God or spirit or ghost and things of that nature until we can apprehend them better. I put them under supernatural. And some may argue that no, if it exists in any capacity, it has to be under the natural set. And I'm like, well, then why do we have the connotation of words? Why would we differentiate if we say, look, yeah, ghosts exist, and if they exist, they're natural? To me, that makes no sense. But Ben, how do you view those?
Yeah, so it's a really good question because it alludes to the fact that the distinction between natural and supernatural can be pretty slippery. And so what I take that distinction to be fundamentally getting at is that there is a sharp distinction of substance in the world. So that substance is that the reality in itself is fundamentally dualistic. That you have these two fundamental kinds of substances. You have natural substances that are in space-time, and you have supernatural substances that are not in space-time. And so what does this extra substance get you? What is the theoretical advantage of having this extra substance? And I think that there is an intuition, a largely shared intuition in our camp, that there just is no that it's a cog or wheel that's not connected to anything. It just spins and doesn't provide us any useful explanatory power. And I think that's largely right. But now more has to be said about this because we can't actually apply this distinction to religious traditions across the board. And so what do I mean by that? So if you take the traditional Western monotheisms like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, we can apply this distinction, usually without any trouble. It's when we get into the particulars that things start to get a little wonky. You get traditions like Mormonism that think that there are multiple gods and that they are physical beings that are out in outer space, and that when we die, our bodies don't leave space-time. They just go to another part of space-time and occupy some celestial body way out in space. And so it's not entirely clear how you square that tradition with traditional Christian perfect being theism. I'll go ahead and grant you I don't know how to square those things, but it's also not clear that you're going to be able to apply this distinction to a tradition like that. So if I was dialoguing with a Mormon and I was like, well, here's an argument for why there is no extra supernatural substance in the world, they would just grant it. They would just say, oh, I concede that. My theology doesn't take us anything outside of anything within space and time. My theology is entirely within space and time. And that they don't have this supernatural realm, or if they do have a supernatural realm, it's not sharply distinguished between substances like I've conceived. They're conceiving of supernatural in some other way. And so you're going to have to dig a little bit deeper to what they mean by that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I approach it.
I don't know if you know this, but I was baptized Mormon.
I did not know that.
Yes, and so I actually have a little bit of understanding of this particular topic. And what you said, it's mixed as far as their actual Mormon theology. Now, there was a book called Mormon Doctrine. It was written by a guy named McConkie, and it's not considered to be scripture, right? It's in fact, the Journals of Discourse are not considered to be scripture either by Mormons. But what you said about God coming from another planet, there's some truism that in those external writings in Mormonism. But they do believe that the celestial kingdom, the telestial, and the celestial, the terrestrial, and the telestial are on a different plane of existence. They're not in the physical universe. So it's a different plane of existence according to the Mormon hierarchical structure. But yes, one thing I do find about the interesting with Mormons, even though, like I said, I long since left the church. I like how they put forth this position that God was a man at one time that went through the same trials and tribulation, became celestialized, and then became a deity, so humans can become like God. I think they at least they attempted to try to explain things in a materialistic way as far as our understanding of things. We grow, we become adults, and then and in this case, they get their own world and dominion to go over, and God was one of us, makes it more relatable. Now, actually, that the evangelistic Christians and the mainstream Christians, they denounce that 100% clearly. But I'm like, you know what? I'd rather have that be true than some of these more evangelistic Christians of a more especially the evil Yahweh type deity type Christians, where they go, yeah, you're going to be in hell, and I'm going to be laughing at you. I think the Mormons have a better approach than that, but that's neither here nor there. I don't believe it, but I agree with you as far as the substances wise, if you want to go that route. But you have to be careful, I think, do not conflate that with substance dualism, right? Which is going to be, unless you're putting that under substance dualism, are you?
So you can't. So there's obviously a nice overlap between those conceptions, and that you'd say that look, our minds do occupy this supernatural realm. It's not within space and time.
But that would make the consciousness
one route you can go. But you're right. The substance dualist doesn't have to admit something like that. They could just say, no. There's in space time, there's two fundamental realities. And then supernatural is something else. So it all depends on the concepts that are in play.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. But I think it would be really careful not to put consciousness under supernatural, because you could. No, I mean, your approach would work, and I'm sure many does do that. I just hesitant to put because consciousness we know exists, right? What it is, what's a substance, that's up for highly technical, disagreements. And the philosophy of mind is, to me, one of the most difficult subjects in philosophy. But I don't put it under consciousness because, we know consciousness does exist. Just because we can't explain it, we don't know if it's phenomenal, we don't know if it's non-reductive. The fact remains, it is something that does have...
Yeah, I think most philosophers of religion, most philosophers of mind would concede that the question shouldn't be framed as, do we have minds or not? Or do we have consciousness or not? The question should be, what sort of things are our minds? What sort of things are consciousness? When we have conscious experiences, the taste of a strawberry, the smell of lilac, the feeling of an orgasm, how does that fit into our understanding of ourselves in a material universe? And so that's the real hard problem of consciousness. It's not saying whether consciousness exists or not. It's asking, what sort of thing is it? How does it fit into the world? And that's where you would get the views that you just alluded to. We might say that it's epiphenomenal in the sense that, there's only causation one way. Our minds don't actually cause anything in the world, but instead, our brain activity causes mental experience, and causation only goes one way. We might be reductive physicalists or eliminativists and think that, look, we have these conscious experiences. However, we describe them using this folk psychology, and that these things that we attribute, the ways that we talk about them by assigning properties like beliefs and intentions and desires, aren't actually things in the world. What are the actual things in the world are C fibers and neurons firing in our brains, given when they're stimulated in certain ways. And so that what needs to change is our language game that describes them.
Yeah, that kind of sounds like material eliminativism.
Yes.
Yeah. By the way, Brandon, we're going to do one call at a time, so I appreciate you calling in and giving us that question. I'm going to take the next caller, and thank you, sir.
Okay, I'll take off.
Okay, thanks. All right, next caller. What we got for you?
Would that be me?
That would be you, sir. Or ma'am, or non-binary or other. We're open inclusive here. We're actually, unlike the actual ACA in those shows, we are LGBTQ plus friendly because we don't care. Come as you are, right? And by the way, on this show, you get to learn about strawberries, lavender, and orgasms. Whoa.
Nice.
In that order. All right. So what you got? What's your question?
Well, I mean, I kind of feel bad about interrupting that moment. That's one of the most interesting topics to me, is like the idea that our feelings are, I mean, they exist, but they're also immaterial, and but anyway.
What's your name, by the way? Who's this?
This is Brady.
Brady.
I've called in once a while ago, probably.
What's your question or questions? Yeah, go for it.
Well, I do have, there's one question that I've always wanted to ask you about, just find out kind of what you think about that, along the lines of materialism, or not materialism, but naturalism. How would you, one of the things like that I think about, on the question of the existence of God, is just like the idea of, we don't really know what the limits of technology are. We don't know if it's possible to have total mastery over matter and, remote knowledge, space, and even possibly time. It's like, if someone were to think that it's possible that what we think of as God is really just like, say, the most powerful being in the universe, does that jump outside of the definition of what should be considered a God, or is that, could you call that God, or you know what I mean? I don't know.
Well, Ben, what do you consider to be God? And I'm going to put my definition on the screen so people can see it on the outside.
So this is a great question. So yeah, you're absolutely right that we could just call the most powerful entity in the universe God. And there's nothing that stops us from doing that. But I think what's more interesting is that there's a conversation that's been happening for thousands of years that refers to God in a way that responds to our religious concerns. So what do I mean by that? So I think what most people have in mind when they're thinking of a God is they're thinking of something that is a fitting object of our worship, something that demands our reference, and something that will respond to our deepest hopes, whether that be a life after death or the promise that justice will be done in the end, and so that evildoers will receive punishment for their wrongdoings, and that those who are praiseworthy will be praised, get what they deserve for having acted in the ways that they have. And so I think it's pretty obvious that if we're just talking about the most powerful entity in the universe, that's likely not going to respond to those religious concerns. And so that would just be a way of using the term God that is outside of the common language game of what we all mean by a God. And so, because like you said, it would be something completely natural. And so the pantheist is going to just say, yeah, the most powerful entity in the universe is God. And that just is the universe as the totality of existence, the totality of nature just is God. But, this is why pantheism isn't seen as really a viable religious option, because it doesn't seem like that's going to give us any hope for petitionary prayer, for a life after death, for justice being done in the end, or for something that's a fitting object of our worship, because it seems like the universe itself is just fundamentally indifferent to us. So why should we worship it? And so that's, most people ask, well, why aren't there more pantheists? That people that use the term God expect that concept to respond to our religious concerns, and the pantheist conception of God just doesn't do that.
Yeah, I happen to agree with that. I don't think that the pantheism, or what's called panentheism, which is actually kind of be a growing movement, but on panentheism, the issue I have with it is you have God that's existing, And then inside God itself is the universe. And so God is actually outside space and time and outside the universe, but the universe is still encapsulated by God. Unlike, more of a pandeist approach or pantheist approach where either God became the universe or intrinsically is the universe itself. Like it permeates everywhere, right? In which case it would be like the greatest being, but if it has no intentionality, no states or anything like that, if it's just the greatest entity in the universe, as you put it, I'm not going to call that a God. It's not constitutive of what I would use as I think Ben perfectly states it, the common language game when we have these discussions of what we mean by a God. Because when people talk about these topics, there's a commonality of what we mean by these things. This is why when an ichtheist, I run into an ichtheist says, what do you mean by God? I'm like, okay, I have to start at square one again, right? And so I like, here, this is my stipulated definition that I have on the screen now. A necessary being or agent with intentionality that all contingents are dependent upon and or can prescriptively change or suspend natural law by having complete dominion over an aspect of nature. If that being right there exists, I'm going to call that a God. What you described as far as this naturalistic being that either doesn't have any intentional states or is the universe itself, it's to me, it fits in the natural set, and it doesn't fit the stipulative usage that I have for that term. Does that help you answer your question? Do you agree with that, Ben?
Yeah. So I largely agree with that. Putting aside the quibbles about Mormonism that I mentioned earlier, I think it's pretty intuitive to most people that if we're talking about naturalism, we're talking about a concept that's just incompatible with theism.
Yes.
And so is there an easy, straightforward way to cash out that incompatibility? And I think there is an easy way. And just by saying that theism is the view that mind is fundamental and that matter is late and local. There was an eternal mind who decided at some point to create a material world. And that's kind of the bare bones of that view. Whereas the naturalist will say, no, matter is fundamental and that minds are late and local and they had to, evolve over a long period of time. And so these two conceptions of natural and supernatural, naturalism and theism are just fundamentally incompatible with one another. They get the order of explanations exactly opposite.
Yeah, and Smitty had pointed out, he says, how is an electron with consciousness or divinity different from one without? And actually, there's a paper out there called Electrons in Love, which is talking about panpsychism. And panpsychism is okay, like I said, I don't think panpsychism is a great argument, obviously, because I don't believe in panpsychism, but it's something that you actually have to look into to actually try to even begin to refute, because the argument's coherent for panpsychism. And I think a lot of people just kind of dismiss things.
I am sympathetic to panpsychism.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to panpsychism too, which is scary, right? Because I've read the papers and I've read the argument.
It sounds crazy. At
it does.
First blush, it just sounds crazy. But then when you realize all of the problems that it solves in the
right?
philosophy of mind and how elegantly it solves
really
the problems
does.
in the philosophy of mind, you go, wow.
There's a simplicity to it. It solves some issues with philosophy of mind, and it's like, I need to really seriously think about this. And that's why when we have like we do shows like this, it's so different from what you would find on the ACA shows, because they dismiss things out, like they don't understand something, they're going to dismiss it outright. And matter of fact, and by the way, we will talk about other people in other shows. I don't care. Matter of fact, Ben and I want to get into that. But there's somebody that used to be on the Non-Sequitur show as a host, who doesn't know F all about anything. And his name was Godless Engineer. And, his entire shtick is basically what you had said earlier of just denialism. It's not even, to me, naive skepticism. It's more radicalized than naive skepticism. It's and just people doubting stuff. It is pure denialism because he doesn't understand the topics well enough to even approach them. I get that with my arguments all the time. People that don't understand my arguments, which are generally logical arguments, they dismiss them outright by fiat rather than trying to understand them. Matt Dillahunty, Aaron Raw, they can't understand my arguments, so they dismiss them. You have some brilliant arguments. I've read your work. And I love what you do. What I do, you take the feedback, you modify it, you fix it, you shore up the hose, you shore up the holes. Yeah, that's going to be taken as a soundbite.
LGBTQ plus positive here.
Yes, we are. we love the hose. Okay, yes, we heard it here. And so you show up your arguments.
No hetero.
In fact, I can say one of the best thing I saw you write was an explanation for against the divine command theory. How, look, you don't even have to accept internalism or externalism, but them existing together provide a viable option that divine command theory is not something that's necessary. And I thought that was extremely good argument, by the way. But by the way, tell people your qualifications, because this guy's legit. I'm just a hack with it. I just do philosophy stuff. This guy's legit. He's got skills.
I hope we've answered the question in at least somewhat of a satisfactory way.
Yeah. Did that answer your question for you?
Well, maybe just talk a little bit about it. To see, in my mind, it's not inconceivable that there is some way to observe matter remotely and to control it remotely, and that there may also be some way for some kind of higher power to be there, just guiding things a little bit. I mean, would that still?
What would that look like? You're not talking about like remote viewing. You're talking about something that exists in some capacity. It's some non-spatial temporal place that can control matter from like the outside space-time. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no. I mean, like, say it was just an advanced technology, but it had power over space and time and matter and the ability to observe everything and, infinite computational power, whatever, like all those things, basically all the things that we think of as the powers of God. But if say it turns out that that's within the realm of possibility of just technology,
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, I get you.
Let's just say it exists with that, and that it is in contact with our world. Would that count, or would you have to differentiate that from being God? Is that
if they're within the laws of physics and they're within nomological understandings of things, then I'm going to call that not a God. But okay. if they can violate at will laws of physics, if they can control reality itself, that makes me more inclined to call that being an all-powerful being, because they can conform they can form reality to their will. So I mean, they could destroy the universe if they wanted to. That's a pretty powerful being. I'm gonna say that that's something like that by will alone, violating laws. Then yeah, why would that not be a God?
Like even when you bring up the example of the Mormons, yeah, they say there's another what do you call it? A reality outside of our own, like a different plane of existence, but they call that existence, they say it's made of matter, just a different type of matter, So then it's like, how is that?
Well,
would that still be considered naturalism, or you know what I mean?
Like, if there's multiple dimensions, or if
it depends.
Maybe, yeah, that's a good answer. It depends.
I know it sounds like a cheap philosophical cop-out, but I mean, it really will depend on what is the concept of naturalism that is being used, and how do you cash out the terms of a different plane of existence.
Mm-hmm.
So I can say that there's different planes of existence in the sense that there are mountain ranges. I can describe things in space and time and say that this is not the same plane as another plane. But if you're going to say that there's something, a plane of existence, that there's different ways in which things can exist, and reality doesn't exist all in the same way, that's going to be clearly incompatible with, the basic form of naturalism that I just laid out, because I want to say, at least in the conception of naturalism that I sympathize with most, it's that natural reality exhausts causal reality. If something is going to stand in causal relations with other things in reality, they all have to exist in the same way. What is that way in which they all fundamentally exist? I'm going to want to say the physical. And now, granted, the physical our concept of the physical keeps expanding and growing. It used to be this Newtonian understanding of space-time, or not space-time, but space and time extended. But then, we discovered electromagnetism. And so we had fields that got put into it. And then Einstein came along and was like, look, space and time are two sides of the same coin. And so our concept of the physical, I grant you, is constantly changing. And nowadays, with consciousness being such a hot topic, maybe consciousness is part of the physical world, the physical world, and that our concept of the physical should include something like proto experience within it. So that conception of naturalism is clearly going to be incompatible with a view that says, look, there's this other plane of existence that's above and beyond what the concept that I just laid out as the physical. But then if they want to say, look, and it causally interacts with our plane of existence, now we've come full circle back to the philosophy of mind and what's known as the interaction problem. How does something outside of space-time, not extended in space and time, causally interact with space and time in such a way that conservation principles of thermodynamics aren't violated? And there's also another problem called the pairing problem. If our minds are non-physical, when I intend to raise my hand, why does my hand raise and not Steve's hand? Why is our mind paired with our particular brain? And so we can give an explanation of that in physical terms because of that's there are events in my brain, and minds depend on this brain. So events in this brain are what cause this mind to have certain effects. This is entirely mysterious, and if there's another plane of existence, how does that pair with other things in this reality? And so those are just problems. Those are just straightforward
a few years ago.
Theories that don't postulate these extra plane of existences just don't have to solve.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I think that even Dr. Shawati's argument that he was trying to say that, look, all the material things that have interrelationships with each other, it's God that's sustaining those dependencies. So you have a upper level things like, he was describing economics that are supervened by lower levels, which are going to be like the mental states. Mental states are the physical states of the brain, the chemical and physiological considerations. And then you go down to the atomic level, and you go down to the nucleus, and you go to the quarks, you go to the strings. There's always going to be something that you go top down.
That's a way of understanding different planes of existence. Like if we're just talking about the hierarchy, no problems arise. It's what happened when the problem arises when we say there's this other plane of existence that's not in space and time, and that it doesn't obey natural laws like conservation of energy. That's where we start to really get problems.
Yeah, I happen to agree with that. Does that more answer your question?
Yeah, that's all I was going to talk about. So thanks, you guys.
Sure.
And
thanks for calling. That was a really good question, by the way.
I love these questions.
Hey, Steve, I really enjoy your show. So yeah.
I appreciate it. And I appreciate the people watching and calling in. Hopefully they can maybe put it on their community tabs or something like that. Let people know that, we're doing this. Because again, I'm not trying to personally compete with the ACA. That's not the goal by any stretch of imagination. The goal is to actually inform atheists that want to learn about these topics so they become better in these discussions with theists and non-believers and atheists themselves, because I find that they constantly are making the same fundamental mistakes and just not understanding things in an appropriate way to have the discussion. Now, again, I'm not an expert in any of these subjects. I am lay as hell, but I've read enough to at least understand the basics where I can try to explain to people. And I know Ben is, much in that same category. And people do respect him quite a bit. I know a lot of professional philosophers that respect his knowledge. As a matter of fact, what actually got me, there's two things that got me interested really in having discussions with Ben. One, Ozzy actually had recommended you, believe it or not.
Thanks, Ozzy.
Yeah. And two, just recently, as a matter of fact, there was that guy named Blog. I don't even want to promote him, but Blogspot, Blog Bitch, or I don't know whatever his name was. And and he did a review of one of your videos that you were on a show with Hayden. I think it was it Christian?
Yeah, Hayden Clark.
Hayden Clark. Yeah, and I've been on Hayden Clark's show as well. Nice guy.
Super great guy.
Yeah, and you were being very, very charitable in your approach and your steel manning, and you were having the argument of, hey, look, maybe these might go on the tick column of a theist a little bit more easily than the atheist has a bigger hurdle. And I was agreeing with you. And by the way, caller, I'm gonna move you out so we can get the Ben back over to his rightful thing in the frame here, because the way we're doing greets, okay?
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Take it easy.
Okay, so there we go. And so, I was watching this and I'm like, first of all, he wasn't listening to what you were saying. Second of all, he was doing the denialism that I think is the most intellectually reprehensible thing that anybody could do, because he wasn't addressing anything that you were saying. It was just the typical diatribe you hear from.
It was comically bad.
Oh, it was. and so I'm listening to this, right? And then I started reading the comments, and I'm thinking, oh man, this guy is probably having like all the ACA fanboys going, oh, you just destroyed that guy. And I'm like, first of all, the guy you're trying to destroy is an atheist, and I mean an outspoken atheist. I'm not going to put you.
He was accusing me of being a theist plant.
Yeah.
Actually a theist pretending to be an atheist, and I was like,
and I get that a lot too. And I'm like, really? But I was just blown away. But I was really surprised by the comment sections supported you. Almost all the comments were like, dude, no. And yet, people, when it happens to me, people are like, yeah, Steve's a closet theist or this, and this. But nobody goes, hey.
I was never more proud to be called a theist than after seeing that video. I was like, okay, I guess if I'm in the theist camp, to not be in your camp, awesome.
Right? Yeah. I mean, talking about tribalism, I'm like, dude, I'm a non-believer too. We're in the same non-believer camp. I don't want that guy in my camp because he makes us all look bad. And this is what I find on the Facebook pages with atheists a lot. They're non-believers. I'm non-believers. Now, again, I say tribalism in jest, but it's still, they make non-believers look bad. So when theists go, yeah, these non-believers, man, they're dumb as hell, they're referring to those types of people that just
I'm almost positive that's how thoughtful theists feel about Kent Hovind in their camp. I'm sure that they look at Kent Hovind and they're just like, come on. Like, you cannot possibly, no, just stop doing that. And that's really how I saw that whole, I was just like, okay, well, I'll just let you hang yourself, because he invited me on to like discuss, and I was like, no, dude.
You had so much support. I was blown. I never got that kind of support from the atheist community, and you and I agree on probably 95% of this stuff on philosophy. We have very similar positions, and yet I get crapped upon. I get vilified mainly because I was one of the OGs that started pointing out these problems with the atheist community from I wouldn't say from the beginning, but at least 5 or 6, no, it's had to be over 7 years ago. I
certainly get vilified for my defense of the historical and contemporary sense of the definition of atheism, what we were talking about before. Like, I've definitely got a ton of pushback on that, but like to the point where I'm just like, this is super surprising. I have no idea why people want to die on the hill of the definition of the word. I think it's like, I hate to say it, but I honestly think it's a really stupid disagreement. It's a disagreement just not worth having. But it makes me more pessimistic, because I'm like, how are we ever going to make progress in the philosophy of religion if we can't even agree on the term that we're going to refer to?
But you got it lucky, because had you been me 6 years ago, I have a group of stalkers that have literally tried to destroy my life because I just dared didisague with them on this particular topic. This was the catalyst.
To me, that blows my mind.
But you've been around. You know this. My fans know. I hate fans. My subscribers and people that support this channel that've been around for a long time. They've seen it happen in real time. They know that this is how I got well known in the atheist community, because I dare speak out against these types of things. And they went after me and my family and friends and people, and vicious. I mean, they were vicious, some of these atheists. And I of course, I don't hold them.
I don't know why. It has to be some sort of deep tribalistic insecurity. To be motivated to want to treat someone I disagree with in that way, just to me seems incredible. Like, I just don't know what world I would want. Now, granted, I have not always responded in conversation in ways that I'm proud of. I certainly take offense, like when I feel like I'm going out of my way to be charitable and steelman and have a productive conversation, and then I feel like I'm being disrespected anyways, and that line is being crossed anyways, I don't respond the best way. I do take offense to it, and I'm trying to get better about that. However, I would never go after someone. I might say something that is mean, but I might be rude in some way, but I wouldn't go after them in a way that would negatively affect their well-being.
I think the reason being is, for some reason, there are sociopaths in various groups, and I think that in when it came to me, those sociopaths just kind of all got together, and they kind of just kind of, they kind of, I guess, amplified each other, right? And so it's more of an exponential thing. And some of them actually agreed with me later on. Matter of fact, two that never went after me personally, Alex O'Connor, aka Cosmic Skeptic, and Stephen Woodworth for Rationality Rules, they were always kind to me. They disagreed with me. They literally, they vehemently disagreed with me for ages. Guess what? They changed their position on.
I know. I recently saw
after they went to school, after they went to college.
Awesome. Which to me, I don't feel any need to try to like bash on them for changing their mind. I want to say good job.
Yes.
Like I want to put them up on a pedestal and say like, this is what intellectual humility looks like.
I
is
couldn't
to be
believe
able
it.
to say, look, this is what I used to think, and this is why I used to think it. Now I don't think that for these reasons.
Yep.
I think that there's almost nothing more instructive than someone doing that, and it really doesn't matter what the subject is. If you're able to, say, hey, this is how reason influenced my beliefs, and how I conformed my belief to what I reason as I saw it. That's a win.
I mean, how much more epistemologically virtuous can you get other than being able to reform your beliefs and your opinions and things of that nature? And by the way, Rationality Rules had messaged me before he did that video. Like when I was ready to message me, I was, hey, by the way, Steve, you might want to watch my next video. I'm like, oh God, what are you doing, man?
That's awesome. No,
yeah.
That's really awesome. Like to me, that's like a huge success story,
yeah.
And like I really like. My pessimistic mood isn't quite as strong after seeing a story. I'm just like, yes.
He put a nod to me. He threw my name out there again. Although he's never really actually supported me, which was kind of odd. I mean, we're in the same camp, but whatever. But it's funny because you talk about epistemically changing things. I have done that something like myself. I had to formulate my positions as I was learning philosophy. I think most people that go through philosophy. Have changes along the way, right? You learn more, you philosophize, right? You're like, okay, I'm this now,
yeah.
But may not stay that position because there's tensions between positions. And I used to self-identify as a apathetic, agnostic, theological, partial theological non-cognitivist. And what I meant by that, right? I was thinking to myself, okay, I'm trying to be as precise as possible. Obviously, there's ambiguity there. But when I say, apatheistic, what I meant by I just don't care about whether God exists a lot as far as a dialogue. Okay, it's not my dog in the fight. I'll talk about it, but I'm not going to promote whether God exists or promote God does not exist. Not my thing. I'm not an atheist or a theist. So that's what I meant by that. I am an agnostic. I would be considered what's called a temporal agnostic, or just an agnostic who has no position either way, undecided, perfect. And then what I meant by a partial theological I am a fence sitter. And what I meant by partial theological and cognitivist was maybe I just kind of leaned that, look, when we're talking about the proposition of God, right? What is that object that we're trying to talk about, whether it exists or not? There seems to be some vagary. Vagary. Is it vagary? No, it's not.
We're sticking with that word.
We're going with vagary. It's not vagary. There seems to be I'll just say ambiguity there. That vagueness. There we go. I'm looking for vagueness. That what are we talking about as far as that particular deity? It's hard to say like a cat has these properties. A cat exists. Cat is on the mat. So what are the defining properties of a deity that we're saying that a deity exists? And I thought at the time that kind of made sense to me. That is this something that's either in truth apt as propositional? But as I've had more dialogues about the topic, I think it absolutely is truth apt, and it can be defined in a way that's cognitively meaningful. And I just eschew atheism now wholeheartedly. I think atheism is just, but that's why I said partial, because I wasn't convinced by it, but I was like, yeah, I kind of see what they're saying on this. What is the object that we're talking about? But I no longer do that. But that's me changing my position. So people say, well, Steve, you were this 5 years ago. I'm like, yeah, 5 years ago. And they use it as a weapon, by the way. Like I'm lying now, because I've changed my position. I'm somehow lying. How does that work, dude?
Sure. I think I've speculated on why I think they're motivated to say that you're lying.
Maybe that
I don't have any empirical insights here, though.
Maybe that would qualify as vagary, because I just have these like weird mood swings, and one day I wake up as a as a theological cognitivist, the next day I wake up as an agnostic or something. But Lines are open if you guys want to call in. I think Ben has at least, you have another 30 minutes?
Yeah,
Okay.
another 30 minutes. And I think we had mentioned maybe discussing ontological arguments.
I'm down
this
with
might
that.
be a good way to. So do you want me to take it just a second and kind of lay out ontological arguments as I see them?
Yeah, I'm going to put up a paper as we do this. If you look in the outside, the kind of a very good ontological argument that, I mean, I'm not good, but I mean, as far as if people want to address it, from a paper that I saw. So you can look at the outside and see that if you want.
So I guess I'll just kind of start from the beginning. Ontological arguments are demonstrations of, or purport to be demonstrations of God's existence from the very concept of God. If we fully understood the concept of God and what we mean by the term God, then we would recognize his existence as necessary, and that the denial of his existence would be a contradiction. And so we find this argument in St. Anselm. That's probably the first early explication of the ontological argument. And so he starts with the concept of God as the concept of the greatest conceivable being that can exist in our minds. And so he says that if such a concept exists in the mind, what we mean by the greatest conceivable being is that it must also exist in reality, because existence is a great making property. If the concept of a greatest possible being only existed in our mind, then an even greater being must be possible, one which exists both in the mind and in reality. So therefore, a greatest possible being must exist in reality. And so this argument was famously responded to by a contemporary of Anselm named Ganilo, who was a monk. And so he raised a parody argument that we could use this form of argument to drive contradictions or have absurd conclusions. And so his absurd conclusion was the idea of a greatest conceivable island. So if existence is a great making property, then these different sorts of things must also necessarily exist if we attribute necessary existence to them. So he was just saying, we can imagine a greatest conceivable island, so there must be this greatest conceivable island, but it just seems absurd to say that there is this greatest conceivable island. More contemporarily, we can. There's been examples, one from Michael Tooley, that we can use this form of argument to just drive contradictions. We can say, look, there must be a greatest conceivable unstoppable force, and there must be a greatest conceivable immovable object. So sound arguments can't yield contradictory conclusions. So there must be something wrong with the form of the argument. And so enter Kant. Kant famously said that, look, existence isn't a real predicate. Subjects of analytic claims that are true by definition, imply their predicates, while subjects of non-analytical claims do not imply their predicates. So contradictions arise when the subject and predicate are both accepted. So non-existent claims cannot be contradictions because such claims deny their predicates.
And this was his a priori synthetic distinctions.
Yeah, so he says so the analytic and non-analytic. So analytic, what is often called synthetic claims. So he's like, look, analytic, to deny that something exists is to just deny a predicate. We can't get a contradiction unless we accept a subject and a predicate of a claim. Mm-hmm. But because non-existent claims deny that predicate, there isn't a contradiction isn't going to arise, because existence is not a real predicate. It's something that something must do in order to have predicates. So the saying that something exists doesn't add anything to the concept. It merely indicates it's obtaining in some possible world. And so nowadays, the ontological argument was in deep trouble for years, and it saw somewhat of a revival 50 years or so ago with Alvin Plantinga in his modal ontological argument. And so modal ontological arguments seek to avoid the objection that existence is not a real predicate by arguing necessary existence is a real predicate. Because something existing in some possible world by modal axiom S5 implies that thing's existence in all possible worlds. So we'll call this property of necessary existence maximal greatness, to use Plantinga's jargon, so that any being with this property is a maximally great being. And so according to Plantinga's argument, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds. Therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. The soundness of this form of ontological argument turns on the metaphysical possibility of a maximal great being. So if it's accepted that it's possible that a maximal great being exists, by modal axiom S5, it follows that a maximally great being exists in the actual world, because one exists in all possible worlds. The actual world is one of all possible worlds. Therefore, God exists. So how do you respond to this argument?
Well, let's just dive in that a little bit, because so people don't get too lost there. Because I was
fair enough. I put a lot on the table.
Great way to explain it. I'm just that's perfect. Okay. So as you pointed out, the ontological argument started back with Anselm, and then they've kind of moved on from them. Plantinga has a much more, his modal ontological argument is a lot more nuanced for that very reason when it deals with modal logic. Which again, I want to point out, this is one of those arguments that, when an atheist gets in a discussion with a theist, and the theist type runs this kind of argument, they cannot just say something like, oh, it defines God into existence. Now, as Ben and I probably would agree, the original version for Anselm, there might be some truisms to that. But the modal ontological by Plantinga is a much more nuanced argument. And so if you look on the screen, basically the form of the ontological argument, which deals with existence, is basically, it starts off, if there's at least a possibility, okay, if it's at least possible, because when you're dealing with modal logic, you're dealing with possible versus necessary, okay, these are Leac modes. And so what we mean by that is something is necessary, it must exist in all possible worlds. If it's possible, it must exist in at least one, but not all, because it would be necessary. If it's not possible, it cannot exist in any. So that pretty much exhausts that space. So it is possible for God to exist. And again, you start getting into these maximally great properties in this. And then if God's existence is possible, then necessary God does exist. And that's an important premise there, because it leaves out a lot of stuff about modal logic that you have to kind of dive into, which Ben will talk about here in a minute as far as S5. And then therefore necessarily God exists. Now, this is not just saying like anything. It's not saying, at least if it's possible that I exist, then I am necessarily in existence, therefore I exist, because I'm not a necessary being. But what the modal S5 axiom allows you to do, and again, you don't have to take it, but what it allows you to do is say this: if something is possibly necessary, it must be necessary. Is that a great way to put it?
Absolutely. And I will also want to emphasize the modal axiom S5 is uncontroversial. It's not something that people seriously deny. If you're saying that it's possible that something exists in all possible worlds. So
well, and I agree with that, but there are forms of other forms of logic that don't use S5 though. If we're talking about some para-consistent other form of logic, sure. But in a standard S5, it's a standard axiom in S5, so it's not like it's a controversial axiom in that form of modal logic. There are other forms of modal logic.
It's no more controversial than the axioms of probability theory or anything like these are just consequences of laying out a system of modal logic.
Correct.
And so how have people responded to this? Well, the obvious way of responding to this is to just run a parity argument with the opposite conclusion. So if you note, this argument often gets accused of begging the question because there's actually no difference between the first premise and the conclusion. All that you've applied to it is trivial claims about modality. And so that it just follows. So the first,
it's logically valid.
Are modally equivalent.
Yes.
To just
modally valid, logically valid. Because when an atheist says, "Oh, that's not valid argument," I cringe. I'm like, "Oh, stop."
So, but there's a symmetry here also that you can just say, "Look, it's possible that a necessary being doesn't exist."
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that's the case, then it follows that a maximally great being doesn't exist in any possible world. So you get this other conclusion that's the exact opposite. So now we have a form of argument with two disagreeing premises. The first premises, one says it's possible that a maximally great being exists, and the other is that it's not possible that a maximally great being exists. Well, how do you decide between these two premises? Is there a symmetry breaker? I don't think there's any such symmetry breaker. I think that once you see the symmetry of the parity argument and and Plantinga's modal ontological argument, you're at an impasse. And so that the modal ontological argument, in my opinion, is just a useless piece of natural theology.
And that's how
if we disagree about the question of God existence, we're not going to resolve that disagreement by appealing to
it doesn't get you anywhere. And that's the problem, because and in Plantinga, but it's funny, Plantinga points this out something very similar. And I don't know if he did it intentionally, of course not, but he points out something very similar in one of his writings, that he gives a straight disjunction, and he says, if 7 + 5 = 14, then God exists. It is not the case that 7 + 5 = 14, therefore God exists. And that is a valid disjunction. There's nothing wrong with that validity. And this is, again, something that atheists really need to understand the distinctions of between a valid argument and a sound one.
Sound argument. That's super crucial. And a cogent argument. There
for
are
induction.
valid arguments. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are sound arguments, and then there's cogent arguments. There's plenty of arguments that are sound that just aren't cogent.
Well, cogency usually goes to inductive arguments, and then you have cogency and weak or strong. So soundness to me only goes to deductive arguments, but in an inductive argument, it's cogent if it's greater than 51% probability, less than 100 because it would be deductively valid, and then it's strong if the premises are true. So you don't say that. Now, I've heard people say sound as well used for that, and I know there's writings for that use the term sound for that.
I think they can still use sound for that.
I've seen it.
So for me, I mean, is it convincing? So the difference between a cogent sound argument and a non-cogent sound argument, we could both say that, look, they have valid true premises, and that their conclusions are true, that they're sound. But
not convincing.
Are they convincing?
Yeah.
Are they convincing to people who disagree with us? If an argument uses the more plausible those premises are, the more that disagreeing parties can concede those premises, the more cogent that argument's going to be.
Yeah, and
so if I'm appealing to, let me give you an example of not a cogent argument, the moral argument. So the moral argument appeals to two controversial premises. It only has two premises. The first premise is that objective moral values and duties imply God. Mm-hmm. They just can't exist without God.
Which I don't agree with.
That's super controversial. Yeah. The second premise is that there are objective moral values and duties. Again, that's controversial. There are moral anti-realists that just deny that claim. So even if we suppose that this argument is sound, it's not cogent because it appeals to clearly controversial premises that disagreeing parties are just not going to reject. Contrast this with something like the problem of evil, where the first premise is that evil implies there is no God. There is evil, therefore no God. Now, the theist might say, look, that first premise is just controversial. I'm not going to accept that first premise. Okay, but that second premise, that evil exists, that's a premise, it's more cogent than the moral argument. Now, we can't say that either of these are sound without begging the question against the other argument here. So soundness isn't the property that's going to help us distinguish between these arguments. They're both valid, so that's not going to help us distinguish between those arguments. So I think it's the cogency.
Yeah, and I've heard those terms used those ways. When I write, we
can use them differently.
I've seen it, but I just for some reason I just always stick with cogency being for inductive arguments. But like I was saying with Plantinga, that is a valid argument that he made. But and even if you argue that it's sound, the problem is, it's like, to a theist, that is a sound argument. Plantinga would argue that's valid and sound. Why? Because he accepts that the God exists. Therefore, the disjunction is the case that if one of the disjunctions is false, the other one's true, then the other one happens to be true. It's disjunctive syllogism.
And the atheist is going to say, look, my argument's valid.
They can say the same thing. They can say 7 plus 5 does equal 14, or God does not exist. It is not the case.
So now we can ask,
therefore God
which
does
one
not
is more
exist.
cogent? We can now ask which one is more cogent.
There's no way to distinguish between the two
no way to distinguish them. That's why I think it's just a useless piece of
right, and
theology.
that's what he points out. He says, look, these are both valid arguments, but one of them is sound. One of them must be a sound argument. The theist is going to argue that his version is the sound argument. The atheist is going to argue that his version is the sound argument. The agnostic, like myself, is going, hey, look, neither of these are convincing to me. You know, they're both valid, but I don't believe God exists, nor believe God does not exist.
It's a cogent symmetry breaker, and I'm skeptical that there's any such symmetry breaker.
But for Plantinga's particular example, you as an atheist, you would have to say the argument 7 plus 5 equals 14, or God does not exist. It is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, therefore God does not exist, is valid and sound to an atheist.
Yeah,
which is
I would
fine.
just deny that, the antecedent of the first.
Yeah, you would say, look, I understand it's not a convincing argument, but
God,
it doesn't get you anywhere. It's just like, yeah, wait, I've already believed that God doesn't exist. This is just reaffirming something that I've already believed,
I would
right?
want to know, what is the connection between
Well, it's
the
a
mathematical
it's
truth?
a disjunction.
Yeah.
Disjunction. And so that's the thing with disjunction in sentential logic, is that who gives a shit about the relationship? Now there's relational logic, but all P and Q requires is the truth value, which is another thing that when I start my arguments on my blog and stuff like that. When I find somebody like tries to attack my arguments and they say one of two things, I'm pretty well done with them. If they say, one, you haven't proved your premises, goodbye. Or two, there's no relationship between P and Q. So what? They don't care about truth values. This isn't relational logic. And so that drives me freaking crazy when I do that. Res Instance, welcome to Aholes Supreme. Oh, thank you. He's back for that. Rez is a huge supporter of my channel. My Patreon, I don't push that much, and I need to, and I apologize for that. I should put this. I'm going to put this on my Patreon when I'm done. And I need to push my Patreon more. I haven't been, because I've been focused on the Non-Sequitur show. But this is my livelihood is this channel. And I want to do more of this. I think most of what I'm going to do in this channel is probably going to be this show with you and other people and whoever wants to call in and solo. I like this format. This is what I really kind of hone in on doing. I'm going to have other things I do on this channel, but I do what I like on this channel, and I like this kind of stuff. I like this kind of topic. There's so much to talk about in philosophy. So there's a never-ending discussion to be had here, because look how long the atheist experience lasted. But as far as going back to the modal ontological argument, with the axioms, it follows. The modal ontological argument is a valid argument, and it could possibly even be sound. But the point is, as you pointed out, so what? You could have an argument that does the opposite. So is equal.
I will say, for your listeners, you can challenge the validness of the argument by saying it begs the question. There is no difference between the first premise and the conclusion, other than the trivial claim, trivial modal semantics you've applied to it.
I agree with that, but
you don't have to go that route.
Yeah, but I wouldn't call it. I want to challenge the validity, because it's still valid logically. Even if I say, look, P therefore P, that's perfectly valid, but it's circular. Right, but it's still valid.
So yeah, but we also want to say that that's invalid, because circular arguments don't support their premises, and we want to say that valid arguments support their premises, support their conclusions. So that's where I would.
I'm gonna look in, because I mean, you have a point, and I understand. And I think that the difference would be from looking from a pure logical point of view as a more discursory point of view, because to me, P therefore P is perfectly valid. Why would it not be valid? I mean, I can put in a logic checker, and the logic checker. So
in one sense, it is valid. So that's what I'm saying. It can be slippery. In one sense, it is valid. Yeah. It's just P was P. It's just a trivial.
It's a trivial validity. Right.
But just because it's trivial, that doesn't mean it's false.
Right. No, exactly. And that's why I say I wouldn't attack it as tracking the validity per se. I would attack it as it has an informal logical fallacy, which means it's not very convincing. But even in a formal logical fallacy, you have to be careful of the fallacy, because the conclusion still could be true.
That's a perfectly fair point too.
So I put on the screen there if you're watching the outside. So by the way, thank you, Rez, again very much. And if you guys want to like become members and Patreon and all that stuff, please do. Again, I'm going to start promoting that more. As you guys know, I moved. My seasonal stuff's over. I'm going to be looking for a job down here. But yeah, by the way, thank you for all your guys messaging me and stuff like that. I've been doing much better in the last couple of weeks. I found my home here. I've lived here 20 years until I moved 7 years ago. And I moved back and I love it here. I'm meeting my old friends again. I'm meeting new people. I'm socializing. And it's been wonderful. So thank you guys for that. All right. So if you look on the screen, this was from a paper that I found, not to get too deep in it, but it's called a modal ontological argument for Leibniz's view of possible worlds by Nino, I would say is Correlia?
I can't see a document.
Oh, look on the video, the outside video, the what people are watching.
Oh, on YouTube.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And so it starts off says possibly there exists a godlike thing, and again they use first order logic for this, which is not an area that I'm anywhere competent in. I just know basics, but enough to read this. So basically, what he's saying is, look, that little diamond symbol. Possible that if there exists X for a group G of X, where X would be God. Okay, so G is the group of the set. There exists a being that he's saying, if it's possible that exists a godlike being in the very first premise. Now again, this goes into the maximally great being. Is it possible to have this godlike entity that has these maximally great qualities? And that is a very important question, I think, for the atheist and theist to really address. I'm unsure of that. I mean, I'm certainly not convinced of it, but I don't deny it either. But someone like Ben would probably say, look, this cannot be this type of being with these types of properties. They're either incoherent with each other or some argument to it why. Obviously, with the logical problem evil, there's clearly that type of being could not exist because it's structurally is an inconsistent system because all the premises cannot be true at once. But, do you accept that there's a possibility that some maximally great being exists? And right now I lean toward no, obviously, because that's the way you'd have to kind of defeat that argument here. But or one way to possibly defeat the argument. But two, then it says necessarily, if there exists a godlike thing, then necessarily there exists a godlike thing in these symbols. And this is basically read as the square means necessary in modal logic. So it is necessary there exists God, therefore it is necessary that God exists. And that's S5 axiom right there, right, Ben? Literally, that literally is using S5.
Yes, that's literally That is a straightforward application of modal axiom S5.
Now you can write these axioms in a lot of different ways. I mean, the thing about modal logic, use different ways to write the same thing. If it's possible that it's necessary, that it's necessary, or just if it's necessary. If it's necessary, this is one way of writing that. You could write it symbolically differently. But therefore, the conclusion is God exists. It is necessary that God exists. Therefore, God exists because it's possible. And you could write that it is possible God exists, therefore it's necessary in a different symbology. That's about logic. There's a lot of different ways to write something. So this is again a little bit more intricate version of the ontological argument that atheists probably would have to at least have a basic understanding of, because when the theists try to run these arguments, they're going to try to run them using this type of reasoning. And the atheist goes, oh, that's stupid. And I'm thinking, no, it's not. It is modal logic and it's valid. It could possibly be sound. I don't care. It's still not convincing because of the reasons you gave, which, again, is a great way to attack this argument. It's a great way to attack it. Say, look.
And not all theistic philosophers are going to take this route either. Not all philosophers of religion are going to want to ascribe something like necessary existence to God. So to take an example, Richard Swinburne, probably the greatest philosopher of religion of the past 100 years. He says that God doesn't exist of metaphysical necessity, but rather exists of factual necessity.
Yeah, there's factual, metaphysical, and logical.
Logical. Yeah. And so he says, look, there might be some possible world where God doesn't exist, but that possible world is not the actual world.
Yeah. And I think Swinburne, and that is Swinburne's position on that. I mean, it's very, very nuanced. And then again, this is why people need to really get into this topic, because I had somebody message me the other day going, hey, Steve, I watched your show with Dr. Sijuwati the other day, and Sijuwati doesn't believe God is a necessary being. I'm like, I kind of got the impression he did, even though he was using Swinburne's argument. But I think it is the case that you have to differentiate between factually possible metaphysically possible, nomologically possible, metaphysically possible. These are all different types of possibilities. And to me, even if God is the case, I don't see a metaphysical necessity for that. You?
Yeah. So let me try to parse out some of the terminology for listeners here. So if I say that something is broadly logically possible, what I mean is that we can coherently describe it without entailing a contradiction. So it's not logically possible that there are married bachelors. That's just not a logical possibility. We can't conceive of it. Now, a metaphysical possibility might be broadly, we might be able to describe it in logic. However, it's not actually metaphysically possible. So to give an example, we can't change the past. So it's just not a metaphysical possibility that we can change the past. Now, there's no logical contradiction in me imagining me having causal powers that change the past. We can, in some, maybe there's a contradiction. It's not obvious, but we would still want to say, look, it's not metaphysically possible for this. And so, and what Swinburne appeals to is what's called factual necessity. He wants to say, look, there's this fact that the universe exists. And so God exists of factual necessity in the sense that if there is a universe, the fact that that universe is going to obtain is because God exists and created it and brought it into existence. So if you have a fact of the universe existing, you have to have this other feature too, God. So if he says it's possible that God doesn't exist, it's not that there's some possible world where there's a universe, but no God. He's saying that, look, it would be a universe with nothing.
It'd be null.
Empty. No, there wouldn't be anything at all.
Yeah, empty.
That's a genuine possibility, and that God is the best explanation of why there is something rather than nothing, because God is factually necessary. If there's something, it's because God brought it into existence.
Yeah, and the concept of a no possible world is fascinating, by the way. But yeah, I think that's a very interesting way to put it, using the history thing, because even if it's logically possible, because God, you would agree, is logically possible. There's nothing against. There's no contradiction. In most interpretations.
I want to say that it's epistemically possible. So I would want to say modally, using modal terms, is that of all the possible worlds, God doesn't exist in any of them. But as far as epistemic possibility goes, can we coherently describe this? Conceptually, it is. It doesn't have an obvious contradiction in it. If there is a contradiction in the concept of God, we have to argue for it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
Just say, "Oh, that's incoherent." Like, you'd have to provide some sort of argument. Why do I say that? Because I think that God is broadly logically possible. I think we can tell a coherent story on the face of it, and if there is a hidden contradiction somewhere in there, or a metaphysical impossibility somewhere in there, we have to find it. We have to dig for it.
Do you hold that if God does exist in a possible world, would you then after acknowledge that he has to exist in all of them, including the extant one?
Yes. So I think that if by definition, the concept of God, how I'm using it, is that such a being would be wholly worthy of our worship. And so his very existence would demand not only our attention, but our reverence. And so that we would have positive duties to this being as well. So I think it's largely uncontroversial that we have duties to our parents. Why do we have duties to our parents? Well, because they're our benefactors.
Right.
Like, we have duties to please our benefactors. Well, God would be our greatest benefactor. So I think it would just follow that we have duties.
I told the same thing. Atheists have said, look, if God exists, I would just totally spit in his face, blah, blah. Like, you'd be so scared, by the way. But
I think that's a super strange route to take, because, again, if we're talking about a greatest possible being, a maximal being that's infinitely loving and cares about me, and that I can have an infinite relationship with and ever grow deeper with him infinitely. So if you're asking, what could be more in my best interests than the existence of such a being, I don't have an answer for that question. I don't know what could be better than a maximally great being.
That's a great point. And I put on the screen here the S5 modal logic as written in the axiomatic form, which is, if A is possible, then it implies that it's necessarily that A is possible, and that actually it would entail that if something is necessary, possibly it's necessary, then it would be necessary. It's just Yeah, that's the best way to read that, I think, right? Have you seen it on the screen?
Yeah, I know it can sound super confusing to people listening, but once you wrap your head around it, it does make very obvious sense that if it's possible that something exists necessarily,
right,
as in all possible worlds. If you're going to say
exists,
if something that can exist in all possible worlds exists in a possible world, then it just follows that thing also exists in all possible worlds.
Yes.
And because once you wrap your head around the confusing jargon, you go, oh yeah, that's just kind of trivially true. Well, yeah, that's why it's an axiom.
Yeah, and that's the same thing, like like these other axioms, and this, if something's necessary, even in M, it exists. If it's possible, then it must be necessarily possible. Because how can something be possible and not be the case that it is possible? So all these things, these modalities kind of play into each other, and again, they just stem from these very axioms of the system. That again, there's more than just one system. M, it was a K, S5, M, Tarski, whatever. But the principle behind the modal logic itself is just dealing with possibilities and necessities. So, going back to the modal ontological argument, to kind of tie it all together so we can wrap up, don't just discount this stuff by just axiomatically, so to speak, to the theist, because you're not arguing on their playing level. If you want to defeat the argument for the modal ontological argument, which is not really a pure defeater by showing the argument's wrong, but you're just showing a flaw in it that's not convincing, by showing that you can make a very simple argument to the other, non-existence of God, and which one are you going to choose? And I think that is the best way to go about, to say, look, this is a valid argument. It's modally, valid and stuff like that, but it's not convincing for these reasons, because I could do the same thing over here.
It's a tentative position, because you can just say, look, if a symmetry breaker comes along,
exactly,
that to prefer, like, you're open to that possibility. I'm skeptical that there's any such symmetry breaker.
Well, unless God revealed himself.
Or unless or I have some other sound argument saying that, look, God is impossible because he has incompatible properties or something. But if I have that argument, I don't really see what the need for a modal.
It doesn't do any good at that point, right? You already proved it. Like the logical problem evil. What else?
So
what
if
else
God
do you
revealed
need?
himself to us again, we wouldn't need the modal ontological argument.
Well, we're gonna wrap this up. But don't you think that a lot of these arguments, especially when the Aquinas' 5 ways and the Anselm's ontological arguments, don't you think a lot of these arguments were more to tell the theist, hey, you believe, and here's some reasons why you should continue to believe. Here's some things to support your belief. I don't think they were really meant to be, and I could be way off on this, but I don't think a lot of these were meant to be convincing to the non-believer to say. So
Plantinga has backed off over the years on the claims he's made about the ontological argument. So he's even said, I don't think this argument is a demonstration of God's existence. What he's trying to do is demonstrate the coherence of theism, and to say that, look, this is a way to show that theism is coherent. But even that claim, he says, it might not even show that.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem with that claim. I mean, to show the coherency of theism is something that a theist, I think, should be able to do in some form. But I also think atheists have the same onus if they're going to get into discussions. And I think next time we are going to, when next time Ben's available, I like to do this all the time, but he's his own life. But I do this every Sunday at least, and if he wants to join, awesome. But I think that I would like to talk about the burden of proof more, because I personally put out that there's many types of burden of proof: epistemic, discursory. There's burden of production, burden of persuasion. There's many different types of burden of proof, evidential. And so when people use this catch-all term burden of proof, I think they lose the understanding of what we're going for, because I still have atheists say, oh, that means you have to prove something. No, it doesn't. Big Bang wasn't a bang either. And so I think that's a great topic for next time, and see if people call in. But we're going to wrap it up. Ben, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. As always, go promote your channel and if you start doing your podcast again.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun. So yeah, as Steve said, I'm one of the hosts of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from non-theist perspectives. And we try to engage in the most serious and charitable ways we can with the most contemporary literature in the philosophy of religion. We try to raise the level of discourse online between atheists and theists. And one of our long-term projects is to try to see what our religious concepts can look like once we've rejected something like theism? Is there still a place for religious forms of life, even if we're not ourselves theists? And so you can look up our podcast anywhere you like to look up podcasts. We're on YouTube, we're on Apple, we're on Podbean. And we also have a social media presence. We have a Facebook, we have a Twitter, we have an Instagram, and hopefully soon we'll have a TikTok as well. I'm still trying to figure this out. I'm realizing that I'm starting to get old when I'm like, oh, what are these damn kids doing in this damn TikTok? So, but we're trying to figure it out, and there's some more content coming out soon. So be sure to check us out.
I just had a phone call. I have no idea where this phone call was. Somebody was trying to call me, and I was like, I got so many windows open. I'm like, it was my I think it was my voice over IP, and I'm like, I can't even answer the phone, but I don't know if they got to do with the show, which, you know, whatever. But I was gonna be like, hey, you're on live, whoever it was, but I don't. If you try calling me, I don't know who you were. I don't. Oh wait, shoot. You know what? Maybe I said missed call. Let me see who it was. It was Jules. Should I call back real quick? I
got time for one more.
Me call her back real quick. This is Jim Jules, so I'm sorry, Mr. Call. So let me call her back and. Jim Jules, you're live on air with me and Ben on Atheological Atheist. However, Ben can't hear you, so I'm gonna have to translate for you. So hi. Oh. So they can hear the outside can hear you, the live chat can hear you, but Ben can't. So do you have a question for us? Because we were streaming live when you called, and I couldn't pick up the phone in time. So do you have a question for us, Jim Jules?
Yes. Crap. You caught me in an unwitty moment. I was going to go with, hi, this is Jules from Match.com.
About your recent application, it's been denied.
No, actually, the polls are in, and your haircut is fabulous.
This is why I keep you around. This is why I adore you. Ben, she just said my haircut was fabulous, and that she's from Match.com, and that my application was generally accepted. No, I'm just kidding. But no, she likes my haircut.
You're in the first interview.
Can you hear
you've been put into the first interview process. So
I'm in the interview process. Oh, good.
Yeah, there was some thumbs up. We got some swipe right on your new photo, your new profile photo, and I was just calling to let you know that there are rave reviews on your new look.
Awesome. So there's some single available women that you wear. Because I saw that you had sent me a picture with about 7, I believe, women together. Was there 7? I counted. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, there's 7. Right?
There were 7?
There were 7 women, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I was only staring at the one in the middle, so whatever. She looked like the leader. Hey, by the way, we got to wrap this up, Jules. Can I show them a picture you sent me? Is that because it's promotional stuff, isn't it? For public release.
Sure.
All right.
I'm now an influencer.
Yeah.
For
so just to let you know, Ben, she's a social media influencer. She has a job now, actually doing influencing stuff. But she sent me a photo the other day of her and some friends. Would you guys on the outside like to see it? Would you like to see it, Ben? Let me download it real quick so I don't show our conversations, because people know I don't show that kind of stuff. But I will show you.
Yeah, if you do, Match.com will deny you.
Match.com will deny me. Yeah. All right, so let me.
We have a no exposing clause.
All right, so let me share this in the internal first, so you can see it inside here, Ben. Wait. Share screen. Share my entire screen. Here we go. What do you think of this, guys? This is what my friends send me. Yes, and then I'll put it on the outside.
Oh wow.
So can you guys see that? Can you guys see that? Oh no, it's not big enough. One sec. I just downloaded it, and I'll show the outside. So not too bad. Guess who that middle person is there, Ben?
I have no idea.
That's Jim Jules.
Oh well, I guess I could have guessed that.
Yes. One sec here. We're gonna do a vote on it when we download it again. How do I download this? Shoot. How do I download this, guys? I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I want the outside to see it. I know you guys can't see it. Open image in new tab. Okay, one sec. Let me take this off screens. So, Ben, if you got to go ahead and hang up if you want. I know you've got family duties, and I don't want to keep you too long.
Yes.
So,
I am. I'm actually gonna go do some more philosophy.
Nice. go philosophize.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. You guys be safe. And hopefully I'll be back on sooner rather than later.
Earth.
What's that?
Hopefully I'll be back on sooner rather than later. Y'all be safe.
Thank you, Ben. All right, buddy. All right, let me see if I can figure out a way to show the outside of this. I'll just make this really... that's not going to work. I don't know how to download this.
Get with the technology, Steve. Jeez. I'm just kidding.
I'm just going to do it the old-fashioned way. I'm just going to show everybody everything. You guys all want to see this, so I'm going to do a video capture or display capture. Let me find display. There we go.
Because you captured somebody's attention here at
Yes.
Match.com.
All right, here we go, guys. This is the wonderful and amazing Jim Jules, who I adore, who's my nutritionist, my dietitian, and my psychologist now too, I guess. You know, what do you guys? Can you guys see that? I can blow it a little bigger, and then have you guys rate this, I guess. Trying to make this as large as possible. Are you watching the outside? Are you watching my show? You're not even watching, are you, Jules? There we go.
I didn't know you were live. I didn't get a notification.
Oh, well, that's a YouTube thing. So the middle one there is clearly her. She's the ringleader, and they all look up to her because she's got the black pants on. And then the girl next to her is a cosmetician. Is that what she said she was? Yeah. Anyways, though, she knows I like Latinas, so she was like, "Hey, Steve, I'm gonna give you a heart attack." And I was like, "I hate you, I hate you, I hate you." All right, I'm gonna have to wrap this up. Jules, you know I adore you, and I appreciate that. And send more of those photos. I mean, yeah, it was nice.
I need to post them on Instagram.
Post them on Instagram, girl. Yeah. You're a full-fledged social media influencer now.
I really am.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
All right.
I made it.
Look, become a non-believer. This is what you get. You know, this is, you know, because my show is the Atheological Aholes. Become a non-believer. Here you go. All right, I'm gonna wrap this up. I'm gonna hang up on you, and I'm probably gonna head out tonight, but I'll call you later on. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Bye. Good night.
Good night, chat. Bye.
All right, guys. I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you guys for watching. Yes, I actually have real life friends. It's amazing, right? Yeah, Latina's a big. Oh man. Yeah. So. I hopefully, as people know, I may have a third date with that one Latina girl. We'll see, you know, whatever. I'm just doing my thing and watching the trolls just lose their shit because it's freaking hilarious with the stories they make up and it's funny because I live with Cano and Cano knows everything goes on. It's like she's like, yeah, everything like this was all exactly what Steve said, and yeah, I still have people going out there, oh my God, Steve got a hooker or something, and it's I'm telling you, these people are sociopaths, man. These people are sociopaths. And this is why I think I want to do these shows to teach people more, or not even teach. I don't even say the word teach because I'm not a teacher. It's not a pedagogical thing. It's just I want to help people become better at understanding certain things. And I think that philosophy and epistemology and atheology are concepts that I think even the theists should you know, have a deeper understanding of as well. Especially when we're talking about these types of subjects, and much of what we do is philosophical in nature. They're philosophizing, and so you know, I want to do this. I'm going to do this show at least once a week on Sunday. If Ben can join, that's great. But if other people can join, that's fine as well. But I might do them throughout the week, and I think this is primarily going to be like my new thing is doing this show. I'm still going to have a rum and coke night. Probably going to have one for my birthday coming up. People ask me to. If I'm still going to go out probably on my 13th or 14th, so I'll probably have a rum and coke night on the 15th to celebrate. And obviously there'll be other things. I'm still going to do reviews on this channel. I'm still going to be, people have sent me videos and say, hey, what do you think of this? And then probably the after shows for certain shows on Non-Secular Show. But with that, Christy Santiago, stop it, Smitty. Yes. Do not make me decide between Christy Santiago and Jim Jules. That is like epistemically impossible. I don't think anybody can make such a decision. There's only one rational answer to be had with that, and that would be both. Good night.
The thing is that we have to go to a higher order than this. We can't use reason on somebody that's not valuing reason in the decision-making process. If you really want to have reason,
I do value reason. It's just we're talking about something that is not
lighter and faster and stronger.
No.
Justified.
I don't